Cars and troikas filled the driveway, which winded through a garden with a fountain and led up to a pistachio-colored palace with arched windows. Stairs led up to a small terrace. 4 columns supported a pediment. The back extremities of the palace were shaped like little towers. Masha leaned forward in Vera's carriage and stared outside. When the carriage pulled to a stop, the young girl watched as the driver came around to open the door for them, then held out his hand first to Vera's chaperone, Madame Grimova, then Vera, and finally her. "Thank you," Masha murmured as she climbed out. The driver blushed, gave her a bashful smile, and answered, "You're welcome, miss." Madame Grimova glanced over her shoulder and frowned disapprovingly. "Come now," she said in her harsh voice, and urged Masha to move on. The young girl hurried up the marble stairs which led to the large entrance, and rode in behind Vera as they went inside. When she handed her felt coat to one of the 2 doormen, Masha felt ashamed by its plainness. It was not made of fur, nor did it have any fur trimmings, and its shape was straight rather than featuring a raised, defined waistline, which had just started becoming fashionable. Masha tried to contain her awe and curiosity as Madame Grimova led the girls into the ballroom. The checkered marble floor glistened in white and pink. The hall was decorated in neoclassical style, simple and not overloaded, but the ballroom, which took up almost the whole south wing of the palace, made up for that with a painted ceiling featuring cherubs. "Do you see Vladimir?" Vera whispered and grasped Masha's hand. She had curled her hair and swept some of it up to the top of her head, while the rest fell around her bare shoulders in lush tendrils. Her blush-colored dress was fringed at the bust and had a high waist, so that the young girl appeared to have long legs. "I don't recognize anyone," Masha noted as she scanned the guests. Along the walls of the giant room, tables had been set up. Refreshments, amuse-bouche, petit four, fresh food. Some men were standing in front of a vodka fountain, laughing. Masha's heart suddenly skipped a beat. The boy with the intense dark eyes, the one whose face she could not forget, was standing there holding a glass of beer. As he brought it to his lips and raised his eyes, his gaze met hers. Just a fracture of a second, the length of a breath. "I see Ivanov," Vera said, and pointed at the director, who had surrounded himself with 3 young dancers from the company, who were giggling behind their fans. Masha frowned. "What is it we're doing here, exactly?" she wanted to know. Vera threw her a puzzled glance and laughed. "We're trying to get invited to dance, silly." Madame Grimova stood behind them with a grim face and straight back. Masha peeked over her shoulder and wondered whether she would dance too, just so as not to let the girls out of her sight. Then she looked back to the table with the vodka fountain. The boy was gone. Vera glided across the dance floor like a swan, her black hair flowing around her shoulders, a smile on her lips as she stared up into the face of yet another contender. She held her head slightly inclined. Her hand lightly rested on the young man's shoulder. Masha watched from the threshold. She too had been asked to dance, but she had felt clumsy and foolish in the arms of strangers. Yet she had noticed the glances she earned. She noticed how the men turned around to stare after her. The boy too had been watching her all evening. Sometimes he had come as close as a few feet. Sometimes he studied her from a distance. The young girl had started feeling irritated by his penetrating, intense gaze, and yet she found herself enjoying his attention. Every time she noticed his eyes on her, she felt a tickling in her body. When their eyes met and his lips curled into a grin, she felt a fluttering in her stomach. He never asked her to dance, though, and soon she was annoyed. Now, as she watched Vera, who was also constantly scrutinized by Madame Grimova, a group of women strode past her and headed to one of the other rooms. Masha realized she didn't know what the rooms were for and suddenly felt intrigued. After making sure that the chaperone's undivided attention was directed at Vera, the young girl sneaked away. The first salon was visited only by men. They drank vodka as they played a game of cards, while those who had already lost stood around the table smoking a cigar and jealously stared at the growing pile of stakes as the remaining players gambled away. Laughter penetrated to Masha from one of the other salons. She moved on and leaned forward to peek inside. Some women idly sat on recliners with either a fan or a glass of cordial in their hand. They talked about who asked who to dance, about the dashing young soldiers, and the girls who were foolish enough to be sweet-talked by them. Did they not know a woman must be chaste? Masha curled her nose and strode by the rest of the rooms, all similarly occupied. Then she saw how a man dressed in uniform led a young girl up the stairs. She seesawed considerably as she dragged herself behind the soldier. At one point she stepped on the seam of her silk dress and almost fell down. Her plangent laughter filled the hallway. All of a sudden, Masha's gaze fell on Vladimir, who was headed outside with a male companion she did not recognize. Vladimir stopped and nodded at her, then scrutinized her curiously. "You're from the company," he noted. "I think I've seen you before." Masha smiled shyly. "Da, yes." His eyes were already glassy, and he tried to focus, as if he were deciphering an illegible word. "You're not one of the popular ones." His tone was harsh. Masha jerked. "If you want to survive here, you have to be." And then he passed her, his companion giving her a dopey grin. Masha felt her cheeks burning. As if it were not enough, she noticed the boy was watching her again. His expression remained motionless when she blinked at him. The young girl looked away, then looked back at him out of the corner of her eye. His lips curled into a complacent smile, which irritated her. Masha gathered her skirts and was about to head back into the ballroom when she heard the sound of a piano from upstairs. The young girl looked up curiously. Puffing laughter followed, and Masha hesitated. Then, slowly, she sneaked to the first floor in search of the music room. She found it 3 doors away and was relieved when she realized the soldier had led his tipsy girl somewhere else. Without reluctance, Masha slipped into the room and closed the door behind her. She stared at the grand piano for a moment, imagining the soft tunes it would release once she played. Her fingers twitched. She couldn't resist. Her dress rustled when she walked up to it, oblivious to the rest of the room. The stucco ceiling with its heavy diamond-clad chandeliers, the flowery pattern carved into the wood panels. She did not notice the large paintings, not that of a cat dressed in a soldier's uniform, not that of a woman with pale skin and rosy cheeks framed by wavy fair hair. This time she played an old folk song, one her father had always sung her to sleep with. It told the story of a boy who would make up riddles for his bride-to-be in order to find out if she was the one. Masha closed her eyes and remembered the lines. "What can burn without being consumed by fire? What can cry without tears?" She could almost feel her father's presence. She saw a vivid image of him, heard his deep voice. Her lips trembled. She couldn't stop playing. Somehow the melody eased her mind. It made her forget. All of a sudden, the door creaked. Masha's eyes flew open and her fingers froze. The tune ended in the wrong keys. The young girl turned around. The boy stood by the door, his back leaning against the frame, and stared at her intently without saying a word. She gazed at him. "I had hoped we would meet one day," he started without taking his keen eyes off her. "I'm Valentin Sorokin." The young girl stifled a smile. So it was true, Vera had been right. "I'm Masha," she replied quietly. He made no indication to join her. Masha studied him for a moment. He was tall and lean. His big hands with the long fingers idly rested against his thighs. He bluntly returned her gaze with eyes as dark as the night, but his beautiful face remained expressionless. She hated that she couldn't see what he thought. His traits were smooth and even. Valentin's oval face was marked by a high forehead and strong jaw, the lines of which blended into a pointed chin. Masha noticed the delicately rolling tip of his nose and his lower lip, which was thicker than the upper one. His black eyes stood out under bushy eyebrows. They were so dark that she thought she couldn't see the pupils. She was fascinated by them. Suddenly unsettled by his intense stare, Masha looked away. Behind Valentin, the soldier and the girl passed in the hall. The girl's hair was tangled, her curls smushed. Masha glanced back at Valentin and tried to find something that she could say to him. She wanted to know about St. Petersburg, about the Imperial Ballet, if he had danced for the Tsar. She couldn't bring herself to speak. Valentin, too, seemed suddenly tense. He stared at his shoes. The young girl saw how the light caught itself in his dark hair and made it shine. Music drifted to them from downstairs, a waltz. All of a sudden, Masha remembered Vera. She got up with a bounce, knocking over her chair. Valentin glanced up in surprise and watched her clumsily put it back in place. Masha gruffly gathered her skirts, oblivious to the fact that she had lifted them too much and he could see her ankles. "I have to go," she muttered. "If Madame Grimova finds me gone, she'll be furious." Then she stopped abruptly and screwed her eyes up to him, looking at him suspiciously. "You probably should wait here a few moments before following me." Valentin raised his brows, and a flash of amusement lit up his eyes.